morning. This is in large part from an article I discovered during an internet search to complement my understanding of the hymn Amazing Grace. I found it in the Library of Congress. My thought for the week is titled The Creation of the Hymn Amazing Grace. Arguably the best known hymn, Amazing Grace, its text, a poem penned in 1772 by John Newton, described the joy and peace of a soul uplifted from despair to salvation through the gift of grace. Newton's words are also a vivid autobiographical commentary on how he was spared from both physical and spiritual ruin. It relates a happy ending of a tale of a defiant man who manages again and again to escape danger, disease, abuse, death, only to revert to struggles between sin and conscience. Newton was born in 1725 in Wapping, London suburb that thrived on shipping and sea trade. His father was a merchant ship captain and was often away on sea voyages, typically lasting 2 and 3 years. During one of these absences, Newton's mother succumbed to tuberculosis, leaving him in the temporary care of her friends, the Catlett family in Kent. His father remarried, and Newton was placed in boarding school. He stayed in close contact with the Catletts, primarily because of their daughter Mary, whom he eventually married. Mary was the cornerstone of Newton's existence. No matter what befell him, his goal was always to return to her. In spite of the powerful message of Amazing Grace, Newton's religious beliefs initially lacked conviction. Raised far from the prevailing Anglican traditions, Newton's youth was marked by religious rebellion and confusion, and he later confirmed a lack of moral self-control and discipline. His father was educated by a Catholic, a Jesuit in Spain. His mother was a so-called nonconformist Christian who rejected the liturgy-based worship of the Church of England. My comment here, okay, perhaps I've led a sheltered life, but I don't ever recall seeing or using the word liturgy, so I had to look it up. And liturgy is a customary repertoire of ideas, phrases, and observances. End of my comment. Nevertheless, Newton's life, rife with dangers, toils, and snares, at which his text hints repeatedly brought him face to face with the notion that he had been miraculously spared. On one occasion, he was thrown from a horse, narrowly missing impalement on a row of sharp stakes. Another time, he arrived too late to board a tender that was carrying his companions to tour a warship. As he watched from shore, the vessel overturned, drowning all of its passengers. Years later, on a hunting expedition in Africa, a moonless night, he and his companions got lost in the swamp. Just as they had resigned themselves to death, the moon appeared, and they were able to return to safety. Such near death were commonplace in Newton's life. Yet no matter how many times he was rescued, Newton relapsed to his old habits, continuing to defy his religious destiny and attempting to dissuade others their beliefs. Of all sins which he later confessed, his habit of chipping away at the faith of others remained heaviest on his heart. In 1744, Newton was coerced into service in the Royal Navy. He was disgraced, relieved of his post, and traded for another man from a passing merchant ship, a slave vessel. Beginning his career as slave trading, Newton soon became tempted by its profits. Merchants believed that trafficking in human trade was justified since slavery was permitted in the Bible as long as the slaves were treated with dignity and kindness. That Newton engaged in the slave trade in such a manner was demonstrated by the willingness of the slaves to secretly carry his letters to port to send to Mary. Despite a promising start with the slaver off the coast of Africa, the African country, Sierra Leone, Newton once again found himself in tough straits. Felled by malaria, he was at the mercy of the slaver's native mistress, whose abuse reduced him to the condition of wretch, he later described in Amazing Grace. He recovered, however, but was soon to face another trial during which he was strengthened and inspired. Thomas A. Kempis's Imitation of Christ. Newton was aboard ship one night when a violent storm broke out. Moments after he left the deck, the crewman who took his place was swept overboard. Although he manned the vessel for the remainder of the tempest, he later commented that through the ordeal he realized that his helplessness and concluded that only the grace of God could save him. Prodded by what he had read in Kempis, Newton took the first, albeit small, step towards accepting religion. The words of the hymn, "This incident marked the hour I first believed." Upon his safe return home in the late 1740s, Newton immediately wrote the Catlett family to plead his case for Mary's hand, even though he could offer her no financial security. When Mary herself replied that she would consider his suit, he returned to slaving to better his fortunes, this time on a ship of slaves bound across Atlantic to Charleston, South Carolina. Newton would marry Catlett in 1750. A changed man, he accepted the helm of a ship bound for Africa. This time he encouraged the sailors under his charge to prayer rather than taunt them for their beliefs. He also began to ensure that every member of his crew treated the human cargo with gentleness and concern. However, it would be another 40 years until Newton openly challenged the trafficking of slaves. Some 3 years after his marriage, Newton suffered a stroke that prevented him from returning to sea. In time, he interpreted this as another step in his spiritual voyage. He assumed the post in the customs office in the port of Liverpool and began to explore Christianity more fully. As Newton attempted to experience all of the various expressions of Christianity, it became clear that he was being called to the ministry. Since Newton lacked the university degree, he could not be ordained through normal channels. However, the landlord of the parish at Olney was so impressed with the letters that Newton had written about his conversion that he offered the church to Newton. He was ordained in June 1764. In Olney, Newton, the new curate, met with poet William Cowper, a newly born-again Christian. Their faith led to the spiritual collaboration and completion that inspired an inspiration for Amazing Grace, the poem Newton most likely penned around Christmas of 1772. Some 60 years later in America, the text was set to the hymn tune New Britain, to which it has been sung ever since. Former slaver is now against slavery. Even though many of England's great shipping cities prospered from the slave trade, social critics began to speak out against the practice in the mid-18th century. By 1780, the powerful voice of William Wilberforce was added to the chorus. Wilberforce, a member of Parliament, was nephew to one of Newton's London friends. Inspired by the former slave trade and paralleling Newton's own conversion, Wilberforce began to question his role in life. Although Newton, a lowly Olney curate, was convinced that Wilberforce was just another wealthy politician, he persuaded him to crusade for change and use his situation in life and his powerful friends, including Prime Minister Pitt, to seek reform. One of the chief topics for such advocacy was abolition. In fact, Wilberforce wrote in his journal in October 28, 1787, that one of the two goals had been set before him was the suppression of the slave trade. Newton joined in the fight for the abolition of slavery by publishing the essay Thoughts upon African Slave Trade. Because Christians still felt that slavery was justified in the Bible, Newton and Wilberforce wisely avoided building their protest on a religious platform. Instead, they condemned the practice as an inhumane treatment of their fellow men and women. Newton, speaking strongly of his own experience, also proposed that the captors were in turn brutalized by their callous treatment and other cited offenses, including torture, rape, and murder. Newton's friend, the poet William Cowper, joined the fight by writing pro-abolition and poems and ballads. In 1789, Wilberforce introduced the bill for the abolition of slavery in Parliament, and the bill faced opposition in both houses. but the forces were against enactment became weaker each time the bill came up for a vote. The bill finally passed the House of Commons in 1804 by the House of Lords in 1807, after which King George III declared it law. There is no direct link between Amazing Grace and the abolition of slavery in Britain. Nonetheless, the hymn was written by a man who was moved to speak out against something which he had profited from. In the essay, Newton said, "I hope it will always be a subject of humiliating reflection to me that I was once active instrument in a business at which my heart now shudders. Thus it seems fitting that the hymn has become for so many, including those fighting for civil rights, the anthem against all forms of social justice." That's the end of the article. In light of this more comprehensive account of Newton's life and the hymn Amazing Grace, the previous version of my thought for the week found its way to file 13. As a note of interest, I used the Library of Congress's free service providing audiobooks for the blind for my late wife. I couldn't not listen while she played the audiobooks, so I became an unintended beneficiary of the service. I should close now, but another thought came to mind regarding God's grace. It's about the first two lines in the song by Chris Christopherson, and it goes something like this. "Why me, Lord? What have I ever done to deserve even one of the pleasures I've known?" As the song goes on, he acknowledges his need for and asks for God's help. I have the pleasure and joy of knowing where I will spend eternity due to God's grace. This concludes my thought for the week. I pray that everyone will remember the reason for the season. Have a very Merry Christmas and best wishes for a healthy and happy New Year.